A millionaire rescued a homeless girl on the street and hired her as a nurse for his sick son. But days later, he was shocked to discover that the girl was the daughter of... The morning light spilled through the half-drawn curtains of a modest kitchen, casting soft shadows on mismatched chairs and a worn wooden table. Natalie sat hunched over a thick medical textbook, her fingers tracing lines of neatly penciled notes in the margins. The quiet hum of the refrigerator accompanied her steady breathing, a rhythm broken only by the clatter of her mother's cup as it hit the counter. "Natalie, you've been at it since dawn. At least eat something," her mother, Christina, said gently, her voice threaded with fatigue. She moved with a weary grace, the shadow of a woman who once carried herself with unshakable confidence. Natalie glanced up, her dark eyes framed by the exhaustion of endless study sessions and unspoken worries. "I'll eat later, Mama. Just a few more pages," she replied, her tone firm but warm. Her mother lingered for a moment, then returned to her tea, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. Their world had changed 6 months ago when the merger of Christina's company left her jobless. The severance pay was a pitiful cushion, barely enough to keep their modest apartment. Christina, once a seasoned accountant with decades of experience, now faces rejection after rejection from firms looking for fresh energy. Natalie, absorbed in the demands of medical school, hadn't realized how thin their resources were until it was too late. The bills mounted. The rent rose. And though Christina insisted, "We'll manage," the strain was etched in the deepening lines on her face. Natalie had considered taking on part-time work, but her mother's gentle but insistent words echoed, "Your studies come first. We'll get through this." But getting through had brought them here, a crumbling rental house on the edge of town. Its sagging porch and peeling paint were a stark contrast to the orderly apartment they once called home. Inside, the walls were blotched with mold that crept into the air like an unwelcome guest, and the floors groaned beneath every cautious step. The cold seeped through the thin windows in winter and clung to the walls like a ghost. One rainy evening, Natalie returned from class to find her mother in the dim kitchen, a single bulb flickering overhead. The smell of damp wood and faint mildew had become part of the house, almost unnoticeable. Her mother was folding a stack of laundry, her fingers slow and deliberate. A cough escaped her lips, sharp and hollow, cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Mama?" Natalie's voice wavered as she set her bag down. Christina smiled faintly, brushing it off with a wave of her hand. "Just a little dust. It's nothing," Christina said, but her daughter saw the truth in her sunken eyes and the way she gripped the counter for balance. That night, Natalie lay awake in her tiny room, the weight of her textbooks now trivial compared to the fear gnawing at her. She thought of her mother's sacrifice, of the countless hours she had spent scrimping and saving for Natalie's education. She had wanted to make her proud, to create a future that would lift them both out of the quiet desperation that had become their lives. But now she felt as though she were drowning in a sea of obligations, unable to save the very person who had given her everything. The fire came without warning. It began with the acrid scent of smoke curling into her dreams. She woke to find her room bathed in a sinister orange glow, shadows dancing wildly on the walls. Her heart pounded as she stumbled out of bed, the heat pressing against her like an unseen force. "Mama!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she ran toward her mother's room. The flames had already devoured the doorway, roaring with an insatiable hunger. "Christina!" Natalie's hands clawed at the edges of the frame, her skin blistering from the heat. She saw her mother's silhouette through the flames, reaching out, but the fire was relentless. A beam collapsed between them, and the world blurred with smoke and tears. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the house was a skeletal ruin, its charred remains a stark silhouette against the dawn sky. Natalie sat on the pavement, wrapped in a coarse blanket, her body trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of what she had lost. Her mother was gone. Everything they had clung to was gone. All that remained was the weight of her grief and the faint scent of ash clinging to her hair. In the days that followed, Natalie wandered through the city like a ghost, her once steady steps stumbling under the crushing void her mother had left behind. The textbooks she had once carried with pride were gone, reduced to cinders like the fragile hope she had nurtured. Homeless, she carried nothing but the guilt of survival and the bitter memory of a future that would never come. Her journey had only begun, but it was one forged in fire, and every step forward felt like walking through its lingering embers. The city felt colder than usual that night, its lights diffused in the mist like distant whispers. Natalie walked aimlessly, her feet sore from endless wandering. The soles of her sneakers were worn thin, letting in the bite of the winter pavement. She pulled her thin coat tighter, but it did little to shield her from the wind, or the gnawing emptiness inside her. It wasn't just the physical cold, it was the silence, the oppressive, suffocating quiet that followed her mother's death, the one that made every moment feel stretched, hollow, and unbearable. Her steps slowed as she approached the bridge spanning the dark river below. The city's hum seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of her shallow breaths and the rhythmic creaking of the metal railings swaying with the wind. She stopped, leaning her palms against the icy steel. Under her, the water churned, an inky expanse reflecting faint shimmers of the moonlight. What's left for me? The question cut through her mind like glass. She tried to summon a reason to keep going, but each thought unraveled into a spiral of doubt. Her mother's face flickered in her mind, her gentle voice, her hands stitching up the same coat Natalie was now wearing. Her mother had been her compass. Without her, Natalie was lost. She climbed up onto the railing, her movements slow and deliberate. The wind tugged at her hair, as if trying to pull her back. Stop. The voice was firm, but calm, startling her enough to make her grip the railing tightly. Turning her head slightly, she saw a man standing a few feet away, his dark coat blending into the night. His face was pale in the dim light, lined with the kind of sorrow that only familiarity could recognize. "Don't come closer," Natalie said sharply, her voice cracking. The man raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, his footsteps halting. "I won't. But you don't have to do this. You don't understand." Her voice was barely audible over the wind. "There's nothing left. No one left." He hesitated, then took a small step forward. "That's not true. You're still here." She laughed bitterly. "And what's the point of that? Everything's gone." "Maybe." His tone softened. "But you're not gone. That means there's still a chance for something else." Natalie's grip tightened on the railing as tears welled up in her eyes. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything." The man's face shifted, shadows deepening his features. "I do." His voice dropped, laced with a rawness that startled her. "I lost my wife. She was the best part of me, and when she was gone, I thought I'd never find a reason to keep moving. But I did." Natalie stared at him, her breath hitching. "How?" "Because I refused to let her be the last chapter of my story," he said simply. "And I can tell you, you don't want this to be your last chapter either." Something in his words struck her like a stone hitting still water, the ripples cutting through her despair. Her legs trembled, and with hesitant movements, she climbed down from the railing. The man exhaled softly, relief evident in his posture. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. Natalie stepped back, arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to hold together the pieces of her fragile resolve. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone defensive, though there was no anger left in her. "Daniel," he replied. "And you?" "Natalie." "Well, Natalie," he said, gesturing toward the street behind him, "there's a cafe just down the block. Let me buy you a cup of coffee." She hesitated, her instincts warring between mistrust and exhaustion. Finally, she nodded, letting him lead the way. The cafe was warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Natalie sat hunched over a steaming cup, her hands trembling slightly as they gripped the ceramic. Daniel sat across from her, his coat folded neatly on the seat beside him. He didn't speak. He didn't push her to fill the silence. "I wanted to be a doctor," she said eventually, her voice almost swallowed by the hum of the cafe. "I was good at it, top of my class." Daniel leaned forward, his expression unreadable but attentive. "But when my mom died," Natalie continued, her gaze fixed on the table, "everything just fell apart." Her shoulders sagged as she exhaled, the weight of her words seeming to crush her further. Daniel didn't interrupt. She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her coat as he watched, appearing embarrassed by her frailty. "I can't fix what happened," she said, her voice breaking. "And I don't know how to start over." "You don't have to do it alone," Daniel said quietly. "I have a son, Jason. He's sick, and I need someone who understands how to care for him. Someone like you." Natalie looked up sharply, disbelief flashing across her face. "Why would you?" "Because I see someone worth helping," Daniel said simply. "And I think you could help him too." For the first time that night, a flicker of something like hope crossed Natalie's face. "Think about it," Daniel added. "If nothing else, it's a start." She nodded slowly, cradling the warmth of the cup between her hands. The bridge was behind her now, and though the road ahead was uncertain, it was no longer empty. The car rolled to a stop in front of a sprawling two-story house, its brick facade glowing warmly under the golden porch lights. Natalie sat frozen in the passenger seat, her hands clenched tightly around the strap of her bag. Daniel turned off the engine and glanced at her. "It's quieter than it looks," he said softly, as though trying to ease her unease. "Come on." She stepped out, the frosty evening air biting at her face as she followed Daniel up the path. The house loomed larger the closer they got, a far cry from the cramped apartments and transient shelter she had grown accustomed to. Through the large front windows, she caught glimpses of soft lighting and polished wooden floors. Her feet hesitated on the threshold. "This way," Daniel said, holding the door open. Inside, the air was warm, scented faintly with lavender. Following the brisk tapping of footsteps, there was a faint echo of dishes clattering from the kitchen. A woman appeared, her blonde hair styled into a neat twist, and her sharp blue eyes flickered between Daniel and Natalie. She was beautiful, polished in a way that made Natalie instantly aware of the scuffs on her shoes and the frayed hem of her coat. Daniel's next wife, she came to him when he was drowning in pain. That appearance, at least, warmed his heart, making him want to treat her well too. "Tiffany," Daniel said, setting his keys on the entryway table. "This is Natalie. She'll be helping care for Jason." Tiffany's lips curled into a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome, Natalie. Daniel's mentioned you." "Thank you," Natalie murmured, her voice barely audible. Tiffany's gaze lingered a beat too long, her smile tightening. "I'll let you settle in before meeting Jason. Dinner will be ready shortly." With that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Daniel led Natalie upstairs to a small but comfortable guest room. The bed was neatly made, and a stack of fresh towels was placed on the dresser. She stood awkwardly in the doorway, clutching her bag. "This is you," Daniel said, gesturing to the room. "Take your time. We'll introduce you to Jason once you're ready." Natalie nodded, her throat tight as she mumbled a thank you. When he left, she sank onto the edge of the bed. The soft mattress beneath her felt almost foreign, like something she didn't deserve. Her eyes wandered to the window overlooking the backyard. Beyond the manicured garden, a lonely swing hung from an old oak tree, swaying gently in the breeze. She traced its movement with her eyes, her thoughts swirling. What am I doing here? The weight of her grief and the strange newness of this place felt overwhelming. Her hands trembled as she unpacked her few belongings, arranging them on the dresser as if to make the room her own. She doubted it ever would be. The clinking of silverware and the polite exchanges of strangers served as the only sounds during dinner. Jason had been too tired to join them, Daniel explained. But Natalie sensed something unspoken in the way Tiffany's hand tightened around her glass of wine when he mentioned the boy. Later, Daniel knocked softly on her door. "Jason's awake if you'd like to meet him." Natalie followed him to a small bedroom down the hall. Jason lay propped up on a mound of pillows, his frame pale and thin under the soft glow of a bedside lamp. His wide brown eyes met hers with a mixture of curiosity and weariness. "Jason, this is Natalie," Daniel said gently. "Hi, Jason," Natalie said, her voice quiet but warm. The boy nodded, his small hand clutching a stuffed rabbit. "You're going to take care of me?" She hesitated, glancing at Daniel before kneeling by the bed. "If you'll let me." Jason studied her for a moment, then nodded again, this time with a faint smile. "Okay." In the days that followed, Natalie began to find her rhythm. Jason was quiet but clever, his face lighting up during their reading sessions or when she played silly games to make him laugh. Each time he smiled, it felt like a small victory. Yet, as she settled into her new role, the unease with Tiffany grew. The woman was polite, always offering a kind word or a tight smile. But Natalie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Tiffany's glances were fleeting, but sharp, like she was cataloguing every misstep. One evening, as Natalie folded laundry in the living room, she overheard Tiffany speaking to Daniel in the next room. "She's young and inexperienced," Tiffany said, her tone measured but cool. "Are you sure this is the right choice for Jason?" "She's exactly what Jason needs," Daniel replied firmly. The words should have comforted Natalie, but instead they deepened her doubts. She returned to her task, her hands shaking slightly as she folded Jason's tiny shirts. What am I to them? A replacement? A mistake? She pushed the thought aside, focusing on the sound of Jason's soft laughter drifting down the hall. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now. Morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a soft glow over the kitchen. Natalie stood at the counter, slicing strawberries for Jason's breakfast. Only the distant chirping of birds outside was able to break the quiet hum of the house. She arranged the fruit on a plate, adding a dollop of yogurt, and smiled at the simple artistry. "You're up early," Tiffany's voice cut through the stillness. Natalie turned to see Tiffany leaning against the doorway, a silk robe cinched tightly around her waist. "I thought I'd prepare something light for Jason," Natalie replied. "He mentioned he liked strawberries." Tiffany's eyes flicked to the plate, then back to Natalie. "How considerate," she said, her tone neutral. She moved into the kitchen, opening cabinets seemingly at random. "Though I'm sure he would have been fine with cereal." Natalie felt a slight flush rise to her cheeks. "I just wanted to—" "Of course," Tiffany interrupted, pulling a mug from a shelf. "Coffee?" "No, thank you." Tiffany poured herself a cup, the rich aroma filling the room. She watched as Natalie cleaned up, her gaze lingering. "You've settled in quickly," she observed. Natalie paused. "I hope that's okay." "Naturally," Tiffany said, sipping her coffee. "Just make sure to remember your place. We have routines here, and it's important they remain consistent." Before Natalie could respond, Jason's footsteps padded into the kitchen. "Good morning," he exclaimed, his face brightening at the sight of Natalie. "Is that for me?" "It is," she said, her smile returning. "Strawberries, just like you wanted." He climbed onto a stool, eagerly reaching for the plate. Tiffany watched the exchange, her fingers tightening around her mug. "Jason," she said, "remember we usually have breakfast together in the dining room." Jason looked between his stepmother and Natalie. "But I like it here," he said softly. Tiffany's expression remained smooth. "Just for today," she relented, "but we'll return to our usual routine tomorrow." Natalie sensed the unspoken tension, but chose to focus on Jason, who was happily munching on his breakfast. "How did you sleep?" she asked him. "Better," he replied between bites. "The story you read helped." "Story?" Tiffany's eyebrow arched. Natalie glanced at her. "Jason had trouble sleeping, so I read to him for a bit." "I see." Tiffany set her mug down with a soft clink. "In the future, perhaps you should consult me before making changes to his bedtime routine." "Of course," Natalie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Later that day, Daniel found Natalie in the garden, kneeling among the rose bushes as she helped Jason plant seeds. The boy chatted animatedly, his cheeks flushed with excitement. "Looks like you two are having fun," Daniel remarked. Natalie looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "We're starting a vegetable patch," she said. "Jason wants to grow carrots." "Carrots are the best," Jason declared, grinning. Daniel chuckled. "Is that so?" As they talked, Daniel observed the ease with which Natalie interacted with his son. There was a gentleness to her, a genuine warmth that seemed to draw Jason out of his shell. It was a change he hadn't anticipated, but found himself grateful for. "You're good with him," Daniel said when Jason ran off to fetch more tools. Natalie shrugged lightly. "He's a special kid." "Thank you," Daniel said, his eyes meeting hers. "For everything." She looked away, a hint of color touching her cheeks. "I'm just glad I can help." Inside, behind an upstairs window, Tiffany watched them. Her fingers drummed against the windowsill, her eyes narrowing as she noted the subtle smiles exchanged between Daniel and Natalie. Turning away, she moved to Daniel's study. The room was immaculate, everything in its place. She sat at his desk, opening the laptop. A quick search brought up minimal information about Natalie. Frustrated, Tiffany delved deeper, checking social media profiles and university records. Bits and pieces emerged: a top student, a promising future cut short. There was mention of a tragedy, but details were scarce. "Interesting," she murmured to herself. The sound of footsteps approaching caused her to snap the laptop shut. Daniel appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing in here?" Tiffany smiled easily. "Looking for the financial reports. I thought I'd review them before our meeting tomorrow." He raised an eyebrow. "They're in the cabinet, where they always are." "Right," she said, standing up. "Must have overlooked them." Daniel watched her for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. "Is everything okay?" "Why wouldn't it be?" Tiffany replied, brushing past him. "Dinner will be ready at 7. That evening, as the household settled, Natalie retreated to her room. She sat by the window, the soft murmur of the house fading into the background. Below, she could see the faint outline of the garden, the newly planted seeds resting under the soil. She wondered if they would take root, if they would flourish here. A soft knock startled her. "Come in," she said. Daniel stepped inside, hesitating at the threshold. "I wanted to check on you." It seemed like Tiffany was a bit tense today. Natalie forced a small smile. "I think she's just protective." "Perhaps," he acknowledged. "But I want you to feel comfortable here. If there's anything you need—" "Thank you," she said softly. "But I'm fine." He nodded, lingering for a moment before turning to leave. "Good night, Natalie." "Good night." As the door closed, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Doubt gnawed at her. Was she overstepping? Did she belong here? Downstairs, Tiffany sat alone in the dimly lit living room, a glass of wine in hand. She scrolled through her phone, eyes fixed on an old photograph of Daniel with his late wife. They looked so happy, so complete. A pang of insecurity tightened her chest. She switched to another tab, reviewing the sparse information she'd found on Natalie. There was more to uncover. There had to be. Determination settled in her eyes. "No one just appears out of nowhere," she whispered to herself. "And I intend to find out exactly who she is." The house was eerily quiet when Tiffany found what she had been searching for. It had taken hours of careful digging through Daniel's files, old emails and confidential documents, but the pieces of the puzzle had finally come together. She stared at the glowing screen, her fingers tightening on the desk's edge as her breath hitched. Daniel's company merger, the one he often referenced as a turning point in his career, had cost hundreds of employees their jobs. Among them was Christina, Natalie's mother. The cold, stark details were all there. The layoffs, the minimal severance packages, and the mounting struggles of those affected. Tiffany sat back, a triumphant but bitter smile curling her lips. She glanced at a family photo on the desk, Daniel smiling warmly, his late wife's arm around his shoulder, and a younger Jason perched on his lap. "Let's see how this plays out," she murmured. Later that evening, Daniel walked into his study, rubbing his temples. Tiffany was seated on the couch, her posture poised but rigid. A glass of wine rested in her hand, untouched. "You're working late," Daniel said, moving toward his desk. "Not exactly," Tiffany replied, her tone light but laced with something sharp. "I came across something interesting while reviewing old records." He paused, glancing at her. "What kind of records?" "Your merger," she said casually, taking a slow sip of wine. "You never mentioned the impact it had on some of the employees." Daniel frowned. "It was a difficult decision, Tiffany. You know that." "Do I?" she countered, standing. "Do you know who one of those employees was?" Christina. Natalie's mother. The air in the room seemed to shift. Daniel froze, his face paling slightly. "What are you talking about?" Tiffany moved closer, holding her phone out to him. "See for yourself. Natalie's mother was one of the employees let go after your merger. A single mother who lost everything. Does that sound familiar?" He stared at the screen, his hand trembling slightly as he took the phone. The words blurred together, but the weight of their meaning was undeniable. His shoulders sagged as he sank into the chair behind him. "I didn't know," he said softly, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't know her story." "But you knew the consequences," Tiffany pressed, her tone colder now. "You just didn't care enough to look closer." Daniel looked up at her, his eyes filled with anguish. "Tiffany, this wasn't intentional. It doesn't matter if it was intentional," she interrupted. "The damage was done. And now, she's here, living under this roof, completely unaware that you're the reason for everything she's lost." The silence that followed was deafening. The next morning, Tiffany found Natalie in the garden, watering the newly planted seeds. The young woman looked up and smiled faintly, but Tiffany's gaze was steely, her steps purposeful. "I thought we should talk," Tiffany said, her voice cool. "Of course," Natalie replied hesitantly, setting the watering can aside. Tiffany crossed her arms. "Do you know why Daniel offered to help you?" Natalie blinked, confused. "Because of Jason. He needed someone to—" "No," Tiffany cut her off, her tone sharp. "It's guilt, Natalie. He feels responsible for what happened to your mother." Natalie's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? His merger, Tiffany said, her words deliberate. The one that made him so wealthy. It cost your mother her job. It's why your life fell apart. Why she... She stopped just short of finishing the thought, her meaning clear. Natalie felt the ground shift beneath her. Her mind raced, fragments of her mother's struggle resurfacing like shards of glass. The unpaid bills, the move to that dreadful house, the fire. It all traced back to this man. Daniel. That can't be true, she whispered, her voice trembling. It is, Tiffany said, with calculated precision. Look it up if you don't believe me. Natalie stumbled back, shaking her head as the weight of the revelation crashed over her. He ruined everything, she choked out, tears brimming in her eyes. I thought you should know, Tiffany said, her tone softening just enough to sound sympathetic. You deserve the truth. That evening, Natalie confronted Daniel in the hallway. He turned, his expression softening when he saw her, but the fury in her eyes stopped him cold. You lied to me, she spat, her voice shaking. You destroyed my mother's life. My life. Natalie, please, Daniel began, his hands raised in a placating gesture. I didn't know. You didn't bother to know, she shouted, her voice echoing through the house. All those nights she cried herself to sleep, all those sacrifices she made. And you were the one who caused it all. Daniel's face crumpled, his own guilt evident in the way his shoulders sagged. I'm sorry. I never meant... I can't stay here, Natalie said, her voice breaking. I can't look at you. She turned and fled up the stairs, ignoring Daniel's calls after her. Inside her room, she hastily packed her few belongings, tears streaming down her face. By the time Daniel reached the front door, she was already gone, her figure disappearing into the night. He stood there, the cold wind biting at his skin, his chest heavy with a pain he hadn't felt in years. Tiffany watched from the shadows of the living room, her wineglass raised in a silent toast. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a genuine smile. Natalie was gone. The city swallowed Natalie whole. The streets blurred as she trudged through the damp evening, the weight of her bag digging into her shoulder. Her breaths were shallow, her chest tight, and her thoughts spiraled uncontrollably. The anger that had flared so fiercely when she left Daniel's house now simmered into a hollow ache. Why didn't I see it before? She thought bitterly. All the kindness, all the opportunities. It wasn't about helping me, it was about him, easing his guilt. Her steps slowed, her body screaming for rest. Natalie found herself slumping against the wall of a narrow alley, her knees buckling as the exhaustion overtook her. She sank to the ground, her back pressed against the cold brick. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, weary but smiling. We'll get through this, she had always said. But they hadn't. They'd been crushed under the weight of a system Natalie now realized Daniel had helped build. In Daniel's home, the silence after Natalie's departure was deafening. Jason noticed immediately. Where's Natalie? He asked that morning, his voice small and trembling. Daniel kneeled beside him, his hand brushing Jason's hair. She needed to leave for a while, Jason, but I'll try to bring her back. Jason frowned, his lip quivering. Did I do something wrong? No, not at all, Daniel said quickly, his heart breaking at the look in his son's eyes. It's not your fault. The words felt empty, even to himself. Daniel knew the truth. It was his fault. Natalie had walked out because of him, because of choices he had made years ago, without thinking of the lives they might destroy. Days passed, and the absence of Natalie began to eat at Daniel. He tried to throw himself into work, But the sight of Jason's quiet despondence made it impossible. The boy, once animated under Natalie's care, had retreated back into himself. He refused to eat more than a few bites and no longer asked to read bedtime stories. "Dad," Jason said one night as Daniel tucked him in, "can you bring her back?" Daniel's chest tightened. "I'm trying, Jason. I promise." Daniel's attempts to locate Natalie began with cautious inquiries, but soon turned desperate. He sent messages to hospitals and shelters, his calls growing more frantic as the days stretched into a week. Each lead fell flat, leaving him more hollow than before. "She's gone, Daniel," Tiffany said one evening, her tone tinged with exasperation. "You did what you could." But he couldn't accept that. He couldn't shake the image of Natalie's tear-streaked face and the anger in her voice. It haunted him in the quiet hours of the night. Natalie's days bled into one another. The money she had taken barely stretched far enough for food and shelter. Her health began to falter. First, a persistent headache, then the gnawing ache in her chest that refused to subside. She told herself she would rest, that she just needed a day to catch her breath. But her body betrayed her. One evening, as she stumbled into a rundown clinic, the nurse at the counter took one look at her pale face and called for assistance. Natalie was too weak to protest as they laid her on a stretcher, her vision blurring. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice was barely audible. "Save your strength," the nurse said firmly. Daniel's phone buzzed late one night. He was seated in his study, his head in his hands. The call startled him, and he stumbled to answer. "Mr. Daniel," the voice on the other end said, "we found her. Natalie." The air seemed to rush from his lungs. "Where is she?" "She's at St. John's Hospital," the voice replied. "She was brought in earlier today in a weakened state. You should come quickly." Daniel was out the door within minutes, his heart pounding as he drove through the darkened streets. His mind raced with questions and fears. Was she okay? How had she ended up in such a state? When he arrived at the hospital, the sight of Natalie stopped him in his tracks. She lay in a small, sterile room, her skin pale and her body frail against the crisp, white sheets. Her breaths were shallow, her eyes closed. "Natalie," he murmured, stepping closer. Her eyebrows fluttered, and when she finally looked at him, her gaze was filled with exhaustion and something else. Resentment. "What are you doing here?" she rasped, her voice barely audible. "I came to find you," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't just let you go." Her laugh was bitter, though it quickly dissolved into a cough. "Why? So you can fix your guilt?" "No," he said quickly. "Because I care about you. About Jason. Please, Natalie, let me help." She turned her head away, her energy spent. Daniel stood there, guilt and determination warring in his chest. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he wasn't willing to lose her now. "I'll stay," he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her bed. "For as long as you need." Natalie didn't respond, her breathing steady as she drifted into sleep. Daniel watched her, his resolve hardening. This time, he wouldn't fail her. Daniel sat beside Natalie's hospital bed, his head bowed, elbows on his knees. The sterile room was filled with a steady hum of machinery, with the soft sound of her breathing interspersed. The pallor of her skin and the dark circles under her eyes cut him deeper than he expected. He had failed her, and the weight of that failure sat heavily on his chest. His mind wandered to Tiffany. He hadn't called her yet, too wrapped up in the moment to face her questions or disapproval. A pang of guilt crept in. Tiffany had been there for him when he needed stability after his wife's death. But now, her voice and her presence felt distant, a world apart from the fragile woman lying before him. We would love to know where on earth our audience is listening to this story. Tell us the name of the city you live in the comments. It would be great if we are close to each other. Now, let's continue the story. Natalie stirred, her lashes fluttering. Daniel leaned forward instinctively, her eyes opened slowly, still glassy and unfocused. "Daniel?" Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Take your time," he said gently. She shifted slightly, wincing as the movement jarred her ribs. Her gaze met his, and for a moment, the resentment from before seemed to soften. "Why are you here?" she asked, her tone quieter this time, less sharp. Daniel admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Because of what I did. About Jason. He misses you so much." A shadow of a smile flickered on Natalie's lips at the mention of Jason. "How is he?" "He's not the same without you," Daniel said honestly. She looked away, staring at the ceiling. "I don't know if I can forgive you, knowing what your decisions did to my mother." "I don't expect forgiveness," Daniel said, his hands clenching tightly. "I just want to make things right, even if it's too late." The next morning, Daniel brought Jason to the hospital. The boy's eyes lit up the moment he saw Natalie. He ran to her bedside, careful but eager, his stuffed rabbit clutched tightly in his hands. "Natalie!" he exclaimed, his voice trembling with joy. "Hey, buddy," she said weakly, her hand reaching out to ruffle his hair. Jason climbed onto the chair beside her, beaming. "I've been planting the garden like you said. The carrots are growing." "Well, I think they are. Dad says they need more time." She chuckled softly, the sound rasping in her chest. "You're doing a great job, Jason. I can't wait to see it." Daniel stood back, watching the exchange with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Seeing Natalie smile again, even faintly, made him hopeful, but the shadow of guilt still loomed. Back at the house, Tiffany paced the living room. The late-night call about Natalie's condition had left her simmering with frustration. Daniel's absence was telling, and his lack of communication only fueled her anger. When he finally returned home with Jason that evening, she was waiting. "You've been gone all day," she said, her voice sharp. "Is she really worth all this?" Daniel's jaw tightened as he shrugged off his coat. "She's not just someone, Tiffany. She's part of this family now." Tiffany scoffed, her arms crossing. "Family? Daniel, she's a stranger. A girl with a sob story who's done nothing but disrupt this house." Daniel turned to face her, his eyes dark. "She saved Jason in more ways than one. Don't forget that." "And what about me?" Tiffany's voice cracked, her frustration spilling over. "I've been here, I've supported you, and now I'm just supposed to take a back seat while you dote on her." "This is about doing what's right," Daniel said, his tone harsher than he intended. Tiffany's eyes narrowed. "Doing what's right, or fixing your guilt?" Daniel looked away, guilt flooding his expression. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Days turned into weeks as Natalie's health slowly improved. Daniel visited daily, bringing Jason along whenever possible. Their time together began to chip away at the walls Natalie had built around herself. One afternoon, as Daniel sat by her bedside, Natalie spoke hesitantly. "Jason seems happier." "He is," Daniel replied, his voice soft. "Because of you." "I'm not sure I can go back to the house," she admitted, her gaze distant. "I think Tiffany doesn't feel comfortable. She'll never accept me." Daniel's chest tightened. He had avoided addressing the growing chasm between Tiffany and himself, but Natalie's words forced him to confront it. "Tiffany and we're complicated," he said finally. "But this isn't about her. It's about you and Jason." Natalie turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "I don't know if I can trust you again." "Then let me earn it," Daniel said earnestly. "I'll do whatever it takes." Back at the house, Tiffany's frustration boiled over into icy detachment. She watched Daniel come and go, his attention entirely consumed by Natalie and Jason. Each passing day felt like a silent rejection, and the once comfortable foundation of their relationship began to crack. One evening, she prevented him as he was leaving for another hospital visit. "This can't go on, Daniel," she said, her voice low but firm. "You have to choose." Daniel paused, his keys dangling from his hand. He met her gaze, his expression weary but resolute. "I already have." Her breath hitched, but she quickly masked the pain with a cold, bitter laugh. "Then, don't expect me to wait for you when this falls apart." Daniel didn't respond. He simply turned and walked out the door, leaving Tiffany alone in the dimly lit room, her glass of wine untouched on the table. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy and unnatural. Tiffany sat in the darkened living room, staring into the dying embers of the fireplace. Daniel hadn't come home for dinner again. The hours she'd spent waiting, replaying their last conversation, only stoked the fire of her resentment. She glanced at the clock, her fingers drumming against the wine glass in her hand. Daniel's words echoed in her mind. "I already have." He'd chosen Natalie and Jason over her, the life they had built together, reduced to an afterthought. The air felt stifling, oppressive. Rising abruptly, Tiffany moved to the kitchen, her steps purposeful. Her gaze fell on the stack of newspapers Daniel had left on the counter, the headlines blaring something about corporate ethics. She brushed them aside and opened a drawer, her hands trembling as she pulled out a box of matches. Her mind raced. She didn't want to hurt anyone, not really. But Daniel needed to see that bringing Natalie back into their lives had been a mistake. If something happened, if Natalie was framed as careless or negligent, Daniel would realize she didn't belong here. With that thought, Tiffany moved toward the den. The curtains there, thick and aged, hung near a radiator. Perfect. Striking a match, she hesitated only briefly before touching the flame to the fabric. It caught quickly, the fire spreading faster than she anticipated. Her heart pounded as she stepped back, watching the flames lick hungrily at the curtains and spread to the wooden paneling. The heat grew unbearable, and panic began to set in. She hadn't meant for it to get this bad. Upstairs, Jason stirred in his bed, coughing as the smoke seeped into his room. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and called out weakly, "Dad! Tiffany?" Hearing nothing, he climbed out of bed, clutching his stuffed rabbit as he stumbled into the smoky hallway. The sight of flames at the end of the corridor froze him in place. Daniel had just parked in the driveway when he noticed the faint glow in the windows. His heart lurched as he realized it wasn't the warm light of the fireplace, but something far more menacing. He bolted out of the car, shouting as he unlocked the door, and rushed inside. "Jason! Tiffany!" he yelled, the acrid smell of smoke filling his lungs. A sound came from upstairs, a faint cry. Daniel didn't hesitate, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He found Jason at the top, coughing and wide-eyed, frozen in fear. "Dad!" Jason choked out, reaching for him. Daniel scooped him up, wrapping his coat around the boy to shield him from the smoke. "It's okay, buddy. I've got you." As he descended the stairs, his eyes caught the blaze in the den. The fire had spread farther than he thought, and the thick smoke made it hard to see. He set Jason down near the front door, pushing him gently outside. "Stay here. Don't move." "But what about Tiffany?" Jason cried, his voice trembling. Daniel turned back, his jaw set. He found Tiffany in the kitchen, standing frozen with tears streaking her face as she stared at the growing inferno. "Tiffany," he shouted, "what did you do?" Her eyes widened as he grabbed her arm, dragging her toward the front door. She resisted weakly, her legs barely moving. "I didn't mean," she started, her voice breaking. "It wasn't supposed to." "Not now," Daniel snapped, pulling her outside, just as flames engulfed the doorway behind them. The fire department arrived moments later, their sirens cutting through the night. Daniel held Jason close as they watched the firefighters battle the blaze. Tiffany stood apart, shivering despite the warmth of the flames. After the fire was extinguished, Daniel went back inside to assess the damage. In the den, near the burned remains of the curtains, he found the box of matches lying on the floor. His chest tightened as the pieces fell into place. He picked it up, staring at it as rage bubbled to the surface. Later that night, as the family stood outside amidst the rubble, Daniel approached Tiffany. She flinched as he stepped close, his expression a mixture of heartbreak and fury. "You set this fire," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "You put Jason's life at risk. You've destroyed this house." "Daniel, I didn't," Tiffany began, but he cut her off. "Stop," he said, his tone sharp. Daniel knew what Tiffany meant to him, but what she did was unforgivable. He didn't want to call the police. He wanted to give his ex-wife a way out. Daniel struggled to speak, but his voice was firm. "Go, Tiffany. I can't keep you anymore. After all, we can't live together like we hoped. No matter what, I'm sure I'm wrong with you. Live, honestly, like you used to. And I need Jason to be safe." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, Daniel thought she might beg, but instead she straightened, the bitterness returning to her gaze. "Fine," she said, her voice cold. "I'll go, but don't expect me to forgive you for choosing her." Daniel didn't respond. He simply turned away, gathering Jason in his arms as Tiffany walked down the driveway and into the night. Back inside, Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, Jason curled up against him, fast asleep. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt empty, yes. But for the first time, Daniel realized that emptiness could be a place to start anew. The first days after the fire were somber and quiet. Daniel moved with purpose, focused on restoring some semblance of stability for Jason, who clung to him more tightly than ever. The remains of the house were cordoned off, the air around it heavy with the acrid smell of smoke. Daniel arranged for a temporary apartment in the city, a smaller, simpler place, but one that felt like a fresh start. Natalie was hesitant when Daniel asked her to join them. She stood in the doorway of her hospital room, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Jason needs you," Daniel replied. His expression was earnest, his eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. "And honestly, I think I need you too." Natalie studied his face for a moment, searching for any trace of pity or ulterior motive. She found none. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay, but just for Jason." The apartment was smaller but warm, with sunlight streaming through its large windows in the mornings. Daniel made sure Natalie had her own room, a small but comfortable space, decorated simply with fresh flowers on the nightstand. Jason was thrilled to see her again, running to her the moment she arrived, his arms outstretched. "Natalie!" he cried, his face lighting up. "Hey, Jason," she said with a smile, kneeling to embrace him. His arms wrapped tightly around her neck, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of belonging. The days settled into a gentle rhythm. Natalie helped Jason with his schoolwork and spent afternoons with him at the park, watching as he laughed and played with a freedom she hadn't seen before. Daniel often joined them, sitting quietly on the bench, a faint smile on his face as he observed the bond between his son and Natalie. At dinner, the three of them sat around the small kitchen table. Daniel cooked most nights. His attempts at simple dishes often met with Jason's enthusiastic approval and Natalie's gentle teasing. "Are these supposed to be pancakes or paperweights?" she joked one evening, poking at the slightly overcooked stack in front of her. Daniel chuckled, his cheeks reddening. "I'm a work in progress." Jason giggled, his laughter filling the space like a balm. Natalie's own laughter followed, soft but genuine. Despite the light moments, Daniel found himself struggling with conflicting emotions. At night, after Jason was asleep, he often sat alone in the living room, his mind a whirl of guilt and uncertainty. He couldn't deny the growing warmth he felt toward Natalie, the way her kindness and resilience seemed to draw him in. But each time the thought surfaced, he pushed it away, reminding himself of the complications, the age gap, and the shadow of Tiffany still lingering. Natalie, too, was undergoing a quiet transformation. The walls she had built around herself began to crack, her once distant demeanor softening as she allowed herself to accept Daniel and Jason's care. There were moments, fleeting but powerful, when she caught herself feeling safe. One afternoon, as she sat on the couch reading with Jason, Daniel entered the room with a tray of tea. He placed it on the table and lingered for a moment, watching the two of them. "You're good for him," Daniel said quietly. Natalie glanced up, surprised. "I think he's good for me," she admitted. "You both are." Daniel smiled, his gaze holding hers for a beat too long before he cleared his throat and turned away. "Well, let me know if you need anything." As he left the room, Natalie stared after him, her chest tightening. For so long, she had believed herself unworthy of stability, of love. But here, in this small apartment, filled with warmth and laughter, she felt something she hadn't in years. Hope. One evening, as Daniel was cleaning up after dinner, Natalie lingered at the counter, drying the last of the dishes. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. Daniel looked up, his hands pausing over the sink. "For what?" "For everything," she said, her eyes meeting his. "For taking me in, for not giving up on me, even when I wanted to give up on myself." His chest tightened, and for a moment, words escaped him. Finally, he said, "You've given us just as much, Natalie. More than you know." The weight of the moment hung between them, unspoken but palpable. Natalie looked away first, her cheeks warming. "Good night," she said softly, retreating to her room. Daniel watched her go, his heart heavier and fuller all at once. As the days turned into weeks, the three of them began to feel more like a family. Jason's laughter returned in full force. Natalie's health improved steadily, and Daniel found a strange sense of peace in the chaos that had brought them together. But beneath the surface, both Daniel and Natalie wrestled with emotions they weren't yet ready to confront. Sitting in the dim glow of his desk lamp, he sifted through old reports from the merger that had irrevocably changed so many lives. The choices he had made in the pursuit of success connected Natalie's story to countless others. He couldn't undo the past, but he could begin to make amends. The next morning, over breakfast, Daniel broached the subject. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation," he said, glancing between Natalie and Jason, "to support families affected by the merger, like yours, Natalie." Natalie paused mid-bite, her fork hovering in the air. "You mean helping people who lost their jobs? Their homes?" "Yes," Daniel said, "and providing educational resources, job training, even housing support. I want it to be a way to give back, to fix what I broke." Jason, ever curious, piped up. "Like helping kids too?" Daniel smiled at his son. "Exactly. Families and kids who need a fresh start." Natalie set her fork down, her expression thoughtful. "It's a good idea," she said softly. "But it'll take more than money. People need to feel heard, understood." Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. "That's why I want you to be a part of it." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Me? You understand better than anyone what these families have been through," he said. "You could help shape how we support them." The vulnerability in his voice made Natalie hesitate, but Jason's enthusiastic grin swayed her. "You'd be great, Natalie," he said. "You're good at helping people." She couldn't help but smile. "Okay, I'll help." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Daniel threw himself into the foundation's planning, meeting with lawyers, former employees, and community leaders to shape the mission. Natalie, though initially unsure of her role, quickly became indispensable. Her insights into the struggles of displaced families brought a depth and humanity to the project that Daniel hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, Daniel and Natalie visited a former employee named Samantha, who now ran a small childcare service out of her home. Samantha's husband had died shortly after the merger, leaving her to support their 3 children alone. As she recounted her story, Natalie listened intently, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "It wasn't just the money," Samantha said, her voice breaking. "It was the feeling that no one cared, that we were disposable." Natalie reached out, her touch light but reassuring. "You weren't disposable," she said firmly, "and we're here to make sure no one else feels that way again." Samantha's eyes filled with tears, and Daniel watched Natalie with a growing sense of admiration. She had a quiet strength that drew people in, a resilience that inspired hope. As the foundation took shape, Daniel found himself spending more time with Natalie. They worked late into the evenings, brainstorming ideas and drafting plans. Their conversations, once stilted and formal, grew easier, filled with moments of laughter and shared understanding. One evening, as they sat in the small living room surrounded by stacks of papers, Daniel leaned back and rubbed his temples. "I didn't realize how much work this would be," he said with a wry smile. Natalie chuckled, handing him a cup of tea. "You're used to building empires. This is just a different kind." He looked at her, his expression softening. "It feels different because it matters more." She met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. The air felt charged, but neither moved to break it. Instead, Natalie looked away, focusing on the papers in her lap. Jason, meanwhile, flourished in their new life. He often accompanied Natalie to community meetings, his boundless energy bringing smiles to weary faces. One afternoon, he tugged on her sleeve as they walked home from a local shelter. "Natalie," he said, his voice earnest, "when I grow up, I want to help kids too." Her heart swelled. "You will, Jason. You already are." His grin was wide and unrestrained. "You think so?" "I know so," she said, ruffling his hair. Daniel watched the exchange from a few steps behind, his chest tightening. Natalie had become more than a caregiver for Jason. She was a part of their family now, though he hadn't yet found the courage to say it aloud. As the foundation launched, the 3 of them attended the opening ceremony together. Daniel spoke first, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He acknowledged his past mistakes and expressed his commitment to building a better future. Natalie spoke next, sharing her story with quiet strength. Her words resonated with the crowd, and Daniel felt a surge of pride. Later that evening, as they walked home, Jason skipped ahead, his laughter echoing in the crisp night air. Daniel and Natalie walked side by side, their steps in sync. "You were amazing today," Daniel said, his voice low. Natalie glanced at him, a faint smile playing on her lips. "So were you." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, before Daniel spoke again. "I couldn't have done this without you." "You could have," Natalie replied, "but I'm glad you didn't have to." Their eyes met, and for the first time, Daniel allowed himself to imagine a future, not just for Jason, but for the three of them together. It was a fragile hope, but it was enough to keep him moving forward. The audience applauded. Natalie was glancing at Daniel and Jason. Sometimes, that light comes from unexpected places, from people who refuse to give up on you, even when you've given up on yourself. As the evening wound down, the three of them found a quiet corner to sit. Jason was busy coloring on a scrap of paper, his energy seemingly endless even after the long event. Daniel and Natalie watched him in silence, their shoulders brushing as they leaned back in their chairs. "This feels surreal," Natalie admitted, breaking the silence. Daniel glanced at her. "It feels right," he said simply. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Do you think this is enough to make up for everything?" "It's a start," Daniel said, his voice steady. "We can't change the past, but we can shape the future." She nodded, her gaze drifting back to Jason. "He's lucky to have you." Daniel hesitated, then said, "He's lucky to have us. You've given him so much. Hope, stability, love." Natalie's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her hands. "I didn't think I'd ever have those things for myself, let alone give them to someone else." "You deserve them," Daniel said, his voice firm. "More than anyone I know." Their eyes met, the weight of their journey reflected in their shared gaze. Daniel reached out, his hand brushing hers lightly. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough to convey what words couldn't. Jason looked up from his drawing, oblivious to the moment between them. "Are we going home now?" Daniel smiled, his hand resting on Jason's head. "Yeah, buddy. Let's go home." As they walked out into the cool night air, the stars above seemed brighter than usual. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a sense of peace, not the fleeting kind that came from distractions, but the kind that came from knowing he was exactly where he was meant to be. Natalie felt it too, her heart lighter as she glanced at the man beside her and the boy ahead of them. They had found their way through pain, through loss, and through doubt. Together, they had built something new, something whole. And for the first time, the future didn't seem so daunting. It seemed hopeful. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.